Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for sticking around. We really have a phenomenal session to end the day. My name is Zachary Snyderman. I'm Mashable's Social Good Associate Editor, and it is my pleasure to introduce Alec Ross. Alec Ross is the Senior Advisor for Innovation to the Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton. His job is to apply emerging technologies to global crises, international diplomacy, and bring the State Department into the digital age. Simple stuff. He'll be joined after his session by Ari Wallach for a quick Q&A. Ari Wallach is the founder of Synthesis Corp, an innovation strategy firm based in New York City. Mr. Ross is talking today about how networks are changing global foreign policy and activism. Please welcome Mr. Ross to the stage.
Thank you. Thank you. Is this the face of power? 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 I'm going to be talking today about a topic that's almost rude to talk about aloud. I'm going to talk a little bit about power. And it's at the core of a lot of what the discussions are about that are taking place today and over the next couple days. And it's at the core of a lot of the discussions that are going to take place at the United Nations across town this week. But I don't think a lot of people are going to actually say the word power aloud. And so I want to talk a little bit about it today. A lot of people talk about the supposed transfer of power from west to east and from north to south, with certain powers growing more powerful and certain countries growing less powerful. You know, I would argue that if there's one thing that I've learned in 2.5 years of being in government, it's that there is actually a far more powerful and far more important transfer of power that's taking place in the world right now. And that is the transfer of power from hierarchies, like governments, and large institutions to individuals and small institutions. And I think that that transfer of power from hierarchies to individuals is going to be a far greater power and far greater importance over the long term than any supposed transfer of power from west to east or from north to south. Now, this is happening very unevenly, and it's happening with a lot of drama, and it's actually happening with a fair amount of bloodshed as well. But make absolutely no mistake, there is a seismic change in the transfer of geopolitical power globally, from the nation state and large institutions to individuals and small institutions. Now, there are cases where this is in America's interests, and there are certain cases where it's not in America's interests. In the case of where it's obviously in our interests, legendary entrepreneur and investor Mark Andreessen wrote recently that just 10 years ago, the cost for running a basic internet application cost about $150,000 per month. What that meant is that if you were going to start a company that had the internet at its core, you basically had to raise a Series A round of venture capital, and you had $1 million plus per year in fixed capital costs. Today, writes Andreessen, that exact same application through the cloud costs $1,500 per month. What that means is that the idea of dorm room companies being able to be built, the idea of people being able to self-underwrite a company or the concept of a company is possible now in a way that it simply wasn't possible 10 or 15 years ago. And this is of unquestionable value to America and to our economy. Think about it this way. Since 1980, 40% of all of America's GDP, 40% comes from companies that did not even exist in 1980. 40% of our GDP comes from companies that didn't exist in 1980. If the United States is going to continue to be a great power in the decades ahead, then in 30 years, 40% of our GDP will come from companies that don't exist today. Now, this is a case where I think clearly the devolution of distribution and processing power to the individual from what normally could have only been done by a big company is an unquestioned good. It's allowing for dorm room entrepreneurs, and frankly, it's going to fill up this slide with the logos of companies that can propel America's future. But I think it's worth saying that technology itself is value neutral. It takes on the values and intentions of the users. And while in certain cases, like people being able to start companies out of the checkbook of an undergrad, it's in our interests. In other cases, it's not always in America's interests. Hillary Clinton has likened our information networks to nuclear power. She says our information networks are like nuclear power. They can either power a city or they can destroy it. In our recent 4-year plan at the State Department, we said that the information revolution is accelerating the pace of international affairs and creating new threats, such as when confidential diplomatic communications are published online, a great threat to people the world around, and undermining the common good. So in ways in which it's not necessarily in America's interests, I trust many of you have heard of WikiLeaks. A couple of you? I believe that WikiLeaks wouldn't have been physically possible 10 or 15 years ago. The processing power and the bandwidth necessary to download 250,000 plus alleged cables wouldn't have existed at anybody's desktop. Further, if you think about the organization that is WikiLeaks, it's a very recent phenomenon for an organization to live principally with a web address instead of a street address and with members and followers instead of paid staff. So this kind of distributed transnational organization that can work against the interests, in this case of the United States government, demonstrates that technology takes on the values and intentions of the users. It doesn't in and itself democratize or do everything that's in America and in Americans' interests. I think one of the best examples that we can see of the changing nature of the distribution of power from hierarchies to sort of the edge of the network can be seen in the Arab Spring. A year and a half ago, nobody would have imagined for a minute that governments like the Mubarak government or the Ben Ali government in Egypt and in Tunisia, and now the al-Assad government in Syria would ever have been able to be overthrown or significantly imperiled. But what technology did there is it wildly accelerated movement making and did so in a way that didn't require hierarchical leadership. Let me ask you, raise your hand if you can name a single leader of the Tunisian, Egyptian, or Syrian revolutions other than Wael Ghanem. Raise your hand. I see 2 hands up. This is the point. The point is that our information networks have distributed leadership and has made leadership more nodal, such that it doesn't take a charismatic figure organizing and inspiring a movement from on high. There is no Valenza. There is no Nelson Mandela. There is no Václav Havel. However, in the face of the growing power of these information networks, governments are oftentimes striking back. Think, for example, about the progression of what's happened in the Middle East. First, in Tunisia, the Tunisian government cyber-attacked and hacked the Facebook accounts of their citizens. Then in Egypt, the Mubarak government shut down mobile and internet networks for 5 days. Then in Syria, the government sort of schizophrenically alternated between shutting down networks and then infiltrating the networks, surveilling them to try to identify political dissent and arrest people based on the communications that were taking place online. And then most recently in Libya, from day one of the revolution, the Gaddafi government just shut down the mobile networks and internet networks. It's sort of a page straight out of the How to Be a Dictator's Handbook to shut down networks at this point. If networks were better for dictators than for dissent, Muammar al-Gaddafi would have flooded Libya with bandwidth. Mubarak would have kept the networks open. But we can see the devolution of power is significantly roiling these environments. At the heart of all of this is the loss of control. The increasing ubiquity and power of these information networks, and the more powerful citizen-centered networks become, the more control government and big corporations lose. The 21st century is a lousy time to be a control freak. And it's interesting. When you think about this loss of control, it's not always about revolutions. A lot of people keep scorecards for the power of the internet about whether a government has been overthrown or not. But I would argue that there are actually far more illustrative examples that come from things having nothing to do with regime change, of a seemingly or somewhat apolitical nature, but with very powerful citizen-centered networks at their core. Consider the recent train crash in China, in the Wenzhou province. 2 high-speed trains collided in July. About 40 people died, 190 some odd people were hurt. And in the immediate aftermath of that train crash, the Chinese government sought immediately to control the information environment, to get it out of public consciousness, and to try to minimize culpability. But through the microblogging site there, Sina Weibo, in 5 days, 26 million people used that service to unearth the real facts about what happened in that train wreck. And it had such an effect that the Chinese government reopened their investigations. They actually unburied one of the train cars that they had interred on the site to be able to do new forensics, and they're now reforming public safety standards. The point in all of this is not that the Chinese government doesn't care about transportation safety. I'm sure they do. The point is that even in a country where significant effort is given to censor networks and to control the information environment, in a country with 485 million internet users, you can't control the information environment. Think about the recent effort by women in Saudi Arabia to drive. There actually isn't a law against women driving in Saudi Arabia, but there is a de facto standard that limits it because of fatwas that have come from local clerics. And what women have done there is they have taken advantage of the connectivity and the voice that they now have to build awareness and create a dialogue, leveraging communications networks to force a discussion in Saudi Arabia, a cause that Hillary Clinton has supported. And what this has done is it's sort of splintered the entrenched interests. There's a princess in Saudi Arabia who's a very outspoken advocate for women being able to drive, and King Abdullah himself has demonstrated more and more that he is in favor of liberalization tactics to empower women. So the point here is that even in societies that significantly restrict access to information, as their societies become increasingly connected, it becomes hard to manage their information. It becomes hard to manage the information environment. There are nearly 1 billion people globally now, 1 billion people, who use the internet in countries that have significant censorship on the internet. Here's the thing, though. The loss of control is going to come inevitably because of network effects. The more people who are online, the more difficult it becomes to control what people say and what people do. And you can't throw 1 billion people in jail. So what are some of the consequences of this? Well, if information equals power, then networked information equals networked power. Think about think about the 20th century and the changing nature of the amount of information we have today versus the amount that we had, say, 30 years ago. 30 years ago, we lived in an environment of information scarcity, where information was largely controlled by central authorities like broadcasters, publishers, governments, and such entities. Corporations and governments spent an enormous amount of money trying to get a little bit more information, trying to gain an edge in the information environment. In the 21st century, we live in an environment of information abundance, where the kind of content that it would have taken a wizened Oxford Don, weeks of research to figure out is now available to any 10-year-old with an iPad. And so today our challenge is far different. Today we've got too much information. And so the challenge today is to figure out what we can do, what we ought to do in an environment of information abundance. And with the increasing amount of intelligence, how can we be responsible citizens? I think about this through the eyes of a diplomat. And what I tell our diplomats is, hey, being a digitally savvy diplomat, being a digitally savvy ambassador, does not mean figuring out how to use all these little gizmos to quote-unquote get the American message out there. Remember, you have one mouth and two ears. Use these tools to learn how to listen. If you, Mr. Ambassador, spend all of your time talking to government ministers and to CEOs, figure out how to use these tools as a way of connecting and engaging with people who you otherwise aren't necessarily connecting and engaging with. And take this abundance of intelligence, detect patterns from it, learn from it, and in the midst of all of this overwhelming amount of information, if we can learn how to distill and process it, then what can come from that is wisdom. Part of that wisdom, I believe, for our diplomats is to recognize that if power is really devolving from the nation state and large institutions and going to citizens, then the building blocks of power are not always sovereign nation states. The conduct of America's foreign policy used to be organized over really simple, clean, binary lines. The struggle between communism and democracy. USA versus USSR. Today, a lot of people would like to similarly define what America's foreign policy ought to be. USA versus China. Established powers versus rising powers. I would argue that that is absolutely the wrong way of looking at it. That all of these are important nodes on the network, but that power can be generated, innovation can be generated at the edge of the network as well. And that is just as likely to be in Brazil, in Indonesia, in Turkey, or Rwanda, as it is in Washington or in Beijing. So with that, what is the face of power in the future? I believe that the great powers of the future will be those that recognize that it's not the strongest of the species who survive, nor the most intelligent, but that which is most adaptable to change. I think that in the future, as power becomes increasingly networked, it will be citizens who are savvy about how to propel the economies and the political movements of the future using these new tools that do not recognize the barrier of vast distances and national borders. I think it's the 2 billion people who are online today, but I also think it's the 2 billion people who are about to join us. I think it's young people growing up in every nook and cranny around the world, including the developing world, who are going to grow up digital and who are going to understand how to harness networks to produce the change and produce societies that we all seek in the future. I think that in the future, that this is going to be the face of power. Thank you very much.
As always, very wise and prescient words by Alec Ross. Again, I'm Ari Wallach, and I'm honored to be here with you today, asking Alec some questions. Just so you know, on the hashtag social good, the number one most kind of, I guess, tweeted quote was, "The 21st century is a lousy time to be a control freak." We saw a couple dozen times that pop up in the past couple of minutes.
Yeah, trust me, my boss and all of those of us in Washington would like to have more control than we do. And what I say is, get used to it. You're not getting it back. It's gone.
So we got a lot of questions from the audience. And the first one is, you know, right now we're in this transitory moment where there is a number of kind of headless movements happening around the world, or, you know, really focused on Arab Spring. And the question is, how does the State Department, being in many ways a 20th century organization, how do you pivot to work with headless movements? And can those headless movements, from your kind of policy perspective, actually eventually become a government? How do you, I mean, eventually, do you not need a head or heads for that official state-to-state type diplomacy that you do?
So this is one of the single biggest challenges in foreign policy right now. I think that while a number of us celebrate the change of power in Libya, in Tunisia, in Egypt, hopefully in Syria before too long, in many respects, the harder work is after those governments fall. And you know, you can spend all day, every day running around Cairo looking for Thomas Jefferson, but you're not going to find him. The charismatic leader who inspires and organizes people from on high, you know, more often than not, simply isn't there. And to the extent that she or he is there, it isn't necessarily broadly recognized within their communities. So there's sort of two ways in which the State Department is responding to that. First of all, it's to try to not be a 20th century organization. You know, if the world is changing, then we have to live the notion that it isn't the strongest who survive, nor the most intelligent, but that most adaptable to change. We're a big old organization, 60,000 people sprawled across 194 countries. But if we don't change, our relevance reduces. So we ourselves are trying to make pivots to be able to do things above and beyond the formal interactions between sovereign nation states. The second thing is, to the extent that there are headless movements, that doesn't necessarily mean it has to be leaderless movements. It doesn't have to be somebody with a halo over their head who's sort of this benevolent, beloved figure that everybody rallies behind, who can be an effective leader. And so one of the things that we're hoping to support is trying to support the creation of inclusive governments that bring in a variety of different perspectives that are legitimately democratic. But that's a lot easier to say sitting here on a stage than to actually catalyze happening in the Middle East. And particularly, as I think a lot of you know, our credibility in that region varies place to place. There are places where our role has been celebrated, but there are places where there are also a lot of questions about the United States. So it makes our engagement there very, very difficult. I'd love to sort of wave the pom-poms here, but it's a lot harder than that.
So, I mean, we have the Arab Spring. We understand where that came from, decades and decades of oppression. But how do non-repressive governments, how are they going to actually make the pivot? I mean, you talked a little about the State Department, but I also think of France and what's happening in England. And it seems like these general, I'd actually argue 18th century structures are now being overturned even in classical Western democracies.
Yeah, so I hope you all noticed when I talked about the transfer of power from nation states and large institutions to individuals and small institutions, I didn't say in other countries. And I didn't say in autocratic countries. I actually believe that this is universal in nature. And so I think that I think the establishment in every country, whether it's mainstream media, whether it's the government, where it's big incumbent companies that stand to lose market share if they're disintermediated in the marketplace, I think established authorities the world around are all having to contend with this disruption. And they can either fight it, they can litigate it, or they can figure out how to best position themselves. And I think that to the extent that they're fighting these changes, then I think that they're swimming against a very strong tide of history.
Yeah, it seems like a lot of these countries are very much they're having their blockbuster moment, and they're seeing these kind of Netflixes around them, and the ability to make that transition is going to happen whether they like it or not. how is, you touched on this a little bit, but I want to drill down into it. In terms of the diplomats that you're actually working with, U.S. diplomats, how are they being forced to really shift how they work at the embassies around the world?
Yeah, so it's interesting, and I'm not just doing this for American diplomats. I've trained, you know, I and my team have actually trained over 500 ambassadors in the last 3 months. And first of all, you know, a lot of them are very eager and excited to sort of figure out and engage with the digital world, because even if they aren't techies, and I'm not a techie, I mean, I was a history major, they do care about power. And you know, if you are a foreign policy savvy individual, if you are an ambassador, maybe you didn't care about technology a couple years ago, but if you've been paying any attention whatsoever, you've now figured out that this stuff is relevant and that it is impacting the conduct of foreign affairs. And so part of it is to train them about what's out there, train them about how it's used. And my attitude too is, if you're uncomfortable with this stuff, if you're uncomfortable with social media, don't use it. But find that savvy 30-something, 20-something in your embassy and empower that individual to use it. And as I said, to listen. Because if you were in Cairo and all you were doing was talking to government ministers, CEOs, and generals, then you had no idea what was happening in Egyptian society. So I actually think it's a foreign policy imperative now for people to at least understand the networked culture, if not necessarily becoming social media savvy oneself.
Great. So you know when when you have a day-long kind of confab like this, someone always comes on stage at the end and kind of repeats back to you what you already learned, kind of like the cliff notes. So that will happen, so don't worry, but we want to do something a little bit different this time. We want you to actually tweet using the social good hashtag, kind of what are the 1 or 2 key takeaways for you today? And those will kind of be incorporated in that cliff notes at the end of, just actually in a couple of minutes, if you can go for that. So our last question, does the State Department want to have a dialogue with those around the world around, let's say, issues of the Middle East or nuclear policy? And if so, how do people go about doing that?
Yeah, so I think the will is certainly there. And what we have to do is we have to take a community of that, I sort of, with a smile on my face, characterize as white shirt, red tie, pinstripe suit diplomats, and help bring them into the networked world and understand how to connect and engage using these tools. And so as a practical matter, the best way you can learn to do it is do it. So I'll just give one example. After the revolution was successful in Egypt, one of the things that we did, trying to recognize again that we have one mouth but 2 ears, was we recognized that, you know what, Egyptian youth were not happy with the United States. They didn't appreciate 40 years of support for the Mubarak regime. They had real questions about what our role was during their revolution. And so, we shared this with Secretary Clinton. And she said, I want to talk to these young people. Let me answer their questions. And that was sort of, she's a very muscular Secretary of State. And this is typical of her. And you know what? 5 years ago, you want to know what we would have done? We would have spent a week vetting nice young Egyptian children who would have come to a fancy room and sat at a mahogany table and sipped tea and asked Hillary Clinton a polite question. We would have had a photographer taking pictures of it, and we would have issued a press release. But one of the great things about social media is we don't have to do that. She can connect and engage with people who would never be able to walk through the front door of our embassies. So we formed a partnership with this Egyptian social media company called Mashable.com. And we said, you know what? You can have Hillary Clinton live for half an hour. Ask the meanest, toughest, most anti-American questions you can find. The only requirement is that they come from Egyptian youth. And so we did this, and people didn't always like her answers because she didn't bother spinning them. But they asked really tough questions. She answered them straight up, and it gave her great street cred in Cairo. And so part of it is, if you think of, when I was talking earlier about the loss of control, amidst the loss of control, one of the things that I think is important is to not stop taking risks. And so part of it is our diplomats, if we're going to use these tools, if we're going to connect in sort of these scary spaces with people who might ask questions and they don't necessarily like us, it is being willing to sort of get in the mix and connect and engage away from that mahogany table with the cup of tea in hand.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for joining us today. I'd like to thank everyone, obviously, for both tweeting in questions and writing them on the note cards. So we're going to have a quick wrap-up, like I said, and thank you again.
Thank you.